March 17, 1943. Berlin. Inside a dimly lit conference room at the Abwehr headquarters, 3 German intelligence officers sat in disbelief. A decoded message had just arrived from one of their most reliable informants in the United States, a man embedded within the industrial heart of Detroit. The report was short, almost unbelievable. It claimed that the Americans were producing one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. Colonel Erich Reinhardt adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, rereading the telegram as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more rational. "This is impossible," he muttered. "Even the Reich's finest factories cannot assemble one aircraft in less than 2 days." But the math was there, cold, mechanical, relentless. The Americans had created something monstrous, something that defied industrial logic. A place called Willow Run. Imagine the moment your entire understanding of war collapses with a single telegram. Across the table, Major Dieter Voss leaned forward. "It must be propaganda," he said. "No factory can build a bomber that fast. We can't even build engines that quickly." Reinhardt's tone hardened. "If it's true, Major, then we are no longer fighting an army. We're fighting a machine." The sound of a clock ticking filled the silence. Outside, the city's night was dimmed under blackout curtains, but inside, the officers' minds raced. If the Americans had truly mastered this level of mass production, the balance of the war was shifting, irreversibly. Detroit, Michigan, winter of 1941. The cold wind cut through the empty fields west of the city. Snow gathered on the shoulders of construction crews working under floodlights, assembling steel frames that stretched farther than the eye could see. The Ford Motor Company had broken ground on a project so ambitious that even its own engineers doubted it could work. A single facility that would mass-produce the B-24 Liberator bomber like automobiles rolling off an assembly line. At the center of it all stood Charles Sorensen, Ford's legendary production wizard. Nicknamed Cast Iron Charlie, for his unbreakable temperament, Sorensen had stood beside Henry Ford since the early days of the Model T. But this project, Willow Run, was something else entirely. The U.S. had entered the war just weeks earlier after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Factories across the nation were converting from civilian goods to weapons of war, but none faced the scale or skepticism that Ford did. Even President Roosevelt's advisors doubted that airplanes, intricate handcrafted machines, could be built by the thousands like cars. "Planes aren't forts," one Army officer sneered during a meeting in early 1942. Sorensen had stared him down and said, "They will be." That night, Sorensen and his engineers spread blueprints across a long table. He sketched out a single continuous line, a mile long, where every section of the bomber would move under one roof, each part built by a new worker trained not in aviation but in repetition. The idea was simple, terrifying, and brilliant. Eliminate the human bottleneck, make war mechanical. Hope born of defiance. Weeks later, trains carried in thousands of workers from all over America. Men from Ohio, women from Kentucky, sharecroppers from the South, and farm kids from Iowa. They lived in hastily built housing near the plant, tiny prefab homes and dormitories in a place they started calling Ipsitucky. At dawn, the sky above Willow Run glowed orange as furnaces roared to life. By day, the air was filled with the smell of oil, steel, and hot rivets. By night, the factory lights burned like a second sun, visible for miles. Inside, the sound was deafening, drills, hammers, conveyor belts clanging. A worker named Helen Davis later recalled. "It was like stepping into another world. You didn't talk, you shouted. You didn't think about time, the line told you when to move." Overwhelmed humanity within the machine. By the summer of 1942, Willow Run was struggling. Every day, thousands of mistakes rippled down the assembly line. Rivets misplaced, wires tangled, engines misaligned. The dream was collapsing under its own weight. Henry Ford, already in his late 70s, demanded the plant remain fully under his company's control, clashing with the military over deadlines. The newspapers mocked him, Ford's flying fiasco. But Sorensen refused to surrender. "We'll fix it," he growled, pacing the catwalk above the assembly floor. "We didn't build an empire to be beaten by our own machines." He began reorganizing the entire factory. Every process was timed to the second. If one worker delayed the line by 3 minutes, Sorensen would appear, stopwatch in hand, demanding an explanation. Workers called him Iron Ghost. The transformation was brutal but effective. By early 1943, the factory that once barely produced a bomber a day was now operating like a living organism. 42,000 workers, 24 hours a day, divided into 3 shifts. Women made up 1/3 of the workforce, their hands learning precision once reserved for aviation specialists. And then, one night in February 1943, it happened. At 3:07 a.m., the first completed B-24 Liberator rolled off the assembly line. It gleamed under fluorescent lights, its olive-drab skin polished like glass. As the workers gathered around, exhausted and teary-eyed, Sorensen simply said, "Now let's do it faster." That single line would terrify Germany more than any weapon. By March, Willow Run was producing one bomber every 63 minutes. German intelligence intercepted early reports but dismissed them as exaggerations, until reconnaissance photos showed hundreds of new bombers parked wing-to-wing across the Michigan snowfields. In Berlin, disbelief turned to dread. The Abwehr's analysts calculated that if the Americans kept up this pace, the Luftwaffe would face 10,000 new bombers by year's end. Even the Führer's inner circle refused to believe it, calling it industrial propaganda. But when Allied bombers began darkening the skies over Hamburg and the Ruhr, the truth could no longer be ignored. One German officer remarked bitterly in his diary, "America is not fighting us with soldiers. It is fighting us with time." Midway call to action. If you've made it this far, comment Willow Run. Let's see how many of you knew this side of World War II. In the chaos of total war, production was power, and America had just built the engine that would never sleep. As spring thawed the Michigan winter, Willow Run expanded yet again. The plant consumed more steel than entire nations, more electricity than some cities. Its workers aged years and months, worn down by exhaustion, pride, and the haunting knowledge that every bomber they built would rain destruction somewhere far away. A woman named Lillian O'Connor later said in an interview, "We didn't think about who it would kill. We thought about ending the war faster." Moral question: would you rather build the weapon that ends the war or refuse to build it at all? In Berlin, Colonel Reinhardt stared at another message coming across the wire. It described something even more terrifying, an expansion of the production model to other factories from California to Texas. America was building not one Willow Run but 5. He crushed his cigarette in the ashtray and whispered, "Then it's already over." But what Reinhardt didn't know, what no German spy yet understood, was that Willow Run's next evolution was about to begin. One that would make even one bomber per hour seem primitive. The next twist will shock you more than anything before. April 2, 1943. Berlin. A rainstorm swept across Tempelhof, turning the tarmac into black glass. Inside a guarded office at the Reich Air Ministry, a courier stood rigidly before a row of senior officers. His boots dripped onto the floor but no one cared. The telegram he carried was stamped, Geheime Reichssache, top secret. Field Marshal Erhard Milch unfolded it slowly. His thin lips tightened as he read. The message, intercepted by German intelligence from a neutral intermediary in Sweden, confirmed what they had feared. American aircraft production had accelerated again. "They've done it," he said quietly. "They've built a machine that makes machines." Around the table, the silence was suffocating. A single fly buzzed against the window. Milch handed the paper to General Galland, the Luftwaffe's star pilot. Galland read, exhaled through his nose and muttered, "If this continues, we'll lose the skies before summer." The telegram was brief, almost sterile in tone, yet the numbers struck like artillery. 1.5 million bomber components every 63 minutes. 25 new bombers a day. Willow Run running at full mechanization capacity. No one spoke for several seconds. The enormity of it didn't fit inside human comprehension. Imagine learning your enemy has outbuilt you not by skill but by scale, a tide of metal you can't shoot down fast enough. In a corner, an intelligence officer named Klaus Wittmann cleared his throat. "Herr Feldmarschall, may I remind you, their people are still untrained. Their planes may be numerous but inferior in quality." Galland's head turned sharply. "You haven't fought them, have you?" His voice was ice. "Quantity becomes quality when you're facing 500 bombers and you have 50 fighters left." Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the reality was even more staggering than the Germans knew. By April 1943, Willow Run was no longer merely a factory, it was a city under one roof. 57,000 workers clocked in each week. Cafeterias fed 10,000 people per meal. The line stretched nearly a mile, snaking through a building so massive that it had its own weather system. On humid days, clouds formed under the rafters. Workers moved in orchestrated rhythm. Riveters hammered the wings of the Liberator until their fingers bled through gloves. Conveyor belts carried fuselages like colossal steel whales. Every minute, another component clicked into place. Helen Davis, the young woman from Kentucky who had come to Michigan with nothing but a suitcase, now oversaw a small crew. "We didn't count time by hours," she said later. "We counted by bombers. If you worked a full shift, that meant maybe 15 new planes went out. 15 reasons the war might end sooner. Hope intertwined with guilt. But not everyone felt that way. Some workers refused overtime after their sons were killed overseas. "I'm not building another damn plane until this war's done," one man shouted, walking off the line. Management replaced him within an hour. The line never stopped. It couldn't. The government was watching closely. Roosevelt's advisors, industrial magnates, and military commanders all visited Willow Run, walking the catwalks above the roaring machinery. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, stood beside Sorensen one afternoon as they looked down at the assembly line. "This," Arnold shouted over the noise, "is how we'll win." Sorensen didn't smile. "If we can keep it running?" Outside the plant, trains loaded with bombers stretched for miles. Each one would fly to different destinations: England, North Africa, the Pacific. Each carried the potential to destroy cities, bridges, families. Moral reflection: can victory ever be clean when built on the backs of so much labor and grief? By the end of that month, reports from occupied France confirmed Luftwaffe morale was collapsing. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, and relentless bombing raids were grinding the German war machine to dust. And yet, inside the walls of the Reich Ministry, denial reigned. "Impossible," Goering bellowed in a meeting. "America cannot produce that much. The factories must be exaggerating for morale." Reinhardt, the colonel who had read the first Willow Run report months earlier, quietly replied, "Then you should tell that to the men in Hamburg. They see the results every night." The conversation ended there. Sometimes, the most terrifying truth is the one your leaders refuse to believe. Back in Michigan, Sorensen's engineers had begun implementing an idea even Ford had resisted: full automation of key processes. Hydraulic lifts, powered drills, precision templates, innovations decades ahead of their time. It wasn't just about faster production anymore. It was about removing human error entirely. Sorensen stood one night at the end of the line, watching the reflection of the factory lights in the polished aluminum of a new Liberator. He wasn't thinking of victory or patriotism. He was thinking of fatigue, the endless churn of progress, the kind that eats men whole. An engineer approached him. "Sir, we're now producing parts for the next series of bombers automatically. We can double within a month." Sorensen's face didn't move. "Double?" "Yes, sir. If we get the resources." He stared at the man for a long time. "Then pray the war ends before we can." Triumph tainted by dread. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the Abwehr received another coded message, this one from a field agent in Lisbon. It included photographs smuggled from a U.S. industrial survey. The images showed bomber parts stacked in hangars like mountains. Fuselages lined up as far as the horizon. And in the corner of one image, a sign, "Output target, one bomber every 55 minutes. Reinhardt dropped the photos onto his desk and whispered, "Mein Gott." He ordered immediate verification. By the time it arrived, the Allies had already begun bombing industrial targets deep inside Germany, not only cities but the very facilities that kept the Luftwaffe alive. A German pilot named Heinrich Vogel wrote in his journal, "They come like a moving sky. There are so many you cannot see the clouds behind them. We shoot until our guns melt." Vogel would be killed weeks later near Bremen. His last recorded radio transmission: "There are too many." Midway engagement: "If you made it this far, comment 'too many', because that's what both sides were thinking in 1943. As America's arsenal swelled, a quiet unease began spreading among the factory workers. They were proud, yes, but exhausted. The repetition was soul-crushing. Accidents happened daily. Fingers lost to machines. Sleepless nights spent dreaming of wings and rivets. Helen Davis said once, "Sometimes I wondered if the factory would ever stop even after the war. Like it had a life of its own." Outside, snow began falling again. The war raged on across oceans, but inside the factory the rhythm stayed constant. One bomber every hour, every shift, every day. Reinhardt knew what it meant. Germany could no longer win through combat. It would need miracles, or madness. And as whispers began circulating about a new weapon in development somewhere in the Reich, his thoughts turned to desperation. Because if Willow Run had taught the world one thing, it was that when human will fused with machinery, there was no turning back. The line between progress and apocalypse had vanished. The next message Reinhardt would receive wouldn't be about bombers, but something far darker. The next twist will change the course of the war itself. If you're still here, comment, "Willow never sleeps." It's how we'll know you saw what's coming. June 10, 1943. The night air over Berlin trembled with sirens. Allied bombers, many of them born in the endless glare of Willow Run's fluorescent lights, were approaching again. From his office window, Colonel Erich Reinhardt could already see the sky pulsing with flashes of flak and tracer fire. The sound was distant yet intimate, like the growl of an approaching storm. On his desk lay another decoded report, its paper still warm from the machine. It was short, clinical, and somehow more frightening than the bombs outside. U.S. Industrial Network now replicating Willow Run model. Target output, 10,000 bombers per month. Reinhardt pressed his palms over his face. 10,000. Even Hitler's most optimistic forecasts for tank production barely reached a fraction of that. The sheer math of it mocked the very idea of German superiority. Imagine fighting a war where the enemy can rebuild their losses faster than you can bury your dead. He walked toward the window, watching another explosion bloom on the horizon. Berlin was burning again. Each fiery blossom reminded him that the war was shifting, not by strategy, not by courage, but by production. Across the ocean in Michigan, the hum of Willow Run was louder than ever. The night shift had begun hours earlier, and the factory glowed like a city of stars. Inside, the workers moved as if part of a single, breathing organism. Every 63 minutes, the line shuddered, and another bomber was born into the world. Helen Davis had been promoted again. She now oversaw the electrical installation section, a job that required precision and speed. Sweat ran down her temples as she leaned over the wing panel, guiding a young recruit through the wiring. "Keep your hands steady," she shouted over the noise. "The wires don't forgive mistakes." The boy nodded, barely 16. Too young for the front, too old to be a child. As the conveyor belts rumbled, Helen looked up and saw something extraordinary, a visitor walking the catwalk above. President Roosevelt himself, in a fedora and thick overcoat, flanked by security and Henry Ford II. Workers stopped what they were doing for just a moment to look. Roosevelt's expression was grave but proud. He tipped his hat toward them. Later Helen would say, he didn't smile. It was like he carried all the deaths he'd just prevented, or caused, on his shoulders. Admiration tangled with unease. Below the catwalk, Sorensen stood waiting for the president. "We're at 1 bomber an hour now, sir," he shouted. Roosevelt raised an eyebrow. "And when will you reach 1 every 30 minutes? Sorensen hesitated. "Soon. But the men and women are at their limit." Roosevelt's voice softened. "So is the world, Mr. Sorensen." Outside, the Michigan sky churned with smoke from foundries and furnaces. The plant consumed more electricity than Detroit itself. And yet, despite exhaustion and shortages, it kept going, because stopping wasn't an option. The German embassy in Stockholm had begun sending frantic dispatches to Berlin. Neutral traders, ship captains, even journalists passing through New York were whispering the same thing. America had turned itself into an industrial storm. Factories in Kansas, Texas, California, all copying Willow Run's design. Production lines stretched for miles. New aircraft variants were rolling out before German engineers could even finish prototypes. By July, the Abwehr had stopped trying to calculate. The numbers no longer made sense. There comes a point in war when arithmetic becomes horror. But not everyone at Willow Run felt triumphant. The line had become merciless. Workers fainted from heat exhaustion. Some died in accidents that never made the papers. Every rivet driven was another day closer to breaking point. Helen watched one of her friends collapse beside the wing of a half-finished bomber. The medics came, wrapped her arm, and carried her out. The line didn't stop. The rhythm never faltered. Later that night, Helen sat alone on the factory floor during a break. Her hands trembled as she lit a cigarette. Around her, the echo of machines filled the silence. She whispered to herself, "We're feeding something that never sleeps." The loneliness of duty. Back in Berlin, Reinhardt's superiors were unraveling. Goring's staff meetings had become chaos, accusations, excuses, and desperate fantasies of new superweapons. They spoke of rockets, jet planes, miracle bombs that could turn the tide. Reinhardt knew better. He'd seen the intelligence, the photos, the maps. "We are not losing because they are smarter," he said during one argument. "We are losing because they can outlast us." Someone slammed a fist on the table. "Then we must destroy their factories." Reinhardt's reply was simple: "There are too many." That night, he walked through the corridors of the Abwehr building and stopped by a window overlooking the city. The fires from the latest air raid still burned in the distance. He thought of Willow Run, of faceless men and women working through the night, safe beneath American skies. For the first time in his career, he wondered if loyalty still meant survival. Midway engagement, If you've made it this far, comment machines of men. It's how we know you're following the human cost behind the numbers. Across the ocean, a new experiment began. Sorensen had ordered sections of the line automated with punch cards, primitive logic systems that allowed machines to repeat sequences without supervision. The concept was revolutionary. One engineer joked, "The factory's learning to think." Sorensen didn't laugh. "Factories that think," he said, "are the beginning of the end of craftsmen." The change worked. Output increased again. But accidents spiked too. Machines that didn't stop when workers made mistakes. One worker's coat got caught in a conveyor. Another was crushed by a wing section. Management paid quietly. The line resumed before the blood dried. In Berlin, Reinhardt received a new file. Inside was a report on something codenamed Project Vengeance. The first V-1 flying bombs were being tested along the Baltic coast. They called them Vergeltungswaffe, weapons of retribution. He stared at the photos, small, sleek, and fast. Nothing like the American bombers. But perhaps, he thought, this could strike back, not against soldiers but against factories. He picked up the phone and made a call to Piemont. When industry becomes a weapon, revenge becomes engineering. A week later, a message arrived from the front. Piemont had been bombed. Hundreds dead. British bombers, escorted by American-made liberators, had turned the testing site into rubble. Reinhardt stared at the message for a long time before folding it in half. Somewhere deep inside, he began to believe that the war was already lost. Not because Germany lacked courage, but because it had underestimated how far a democracy could go when it built for annihilation. In Michigan, Helen Davis finished her shift and walked out into the warm night air. She looked up at the stars, bright, countless, unreachable, and thought of the sky over Europe, burning. She didn't know that one of the planes she helped wire that month would fly over Hamburg within days, dropping the very fire she feared. The next morning, newspapers across America would celebrate the arsenal of democracy. None would mention the price the workers were paying. The machinery roared on. If you're still watching, tell me, what's worse? A war fought by men or one fought by factories? The next moment in this story will take us inside the German resistance. Men who realized their own leaders would rather burn Europe than surrender. The next twist will tear loyalty itself apart. August 12, 1943. The air over Berlin was thick with the smell of smoke and metal. The city had endured yet another bombing raid the night before. Streets turned to rivers of ash, the sky a dull red bruise that refused to fade. Colonel Reinhardt hadn't slept. He sat alone in his office at dawn, staring at a stack of decrypted American communications. One word appeared again and again: expansion. Factories in Tulsa, Dallas, San Diego, even Seattle, all following the Willow Run blueprint. Every one of them mass-producing bombers, parts, and engines at a pace that mocked the laws of physics. The United States wasn't building an army anymore, it was building an ecosystem of destruction. Reinhardt lit another cigarette and whispered, This is the end of Europe." He wasn't being dramatic. Even the most optimistic Luftwaffe estimates now admitted what everyone feared. For every German aircraft destroyed, America built 5 new ones. How do you fight an enemy whose strength multiplies faster than your hope can recover? Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in Michigan, a different kind of war raged. A war of exhaustion, automation, and the slow erosion of human limits. The August heat had turned Willow Run into a furnace. The factory's vast glass roof trapped the sun's glare, and workers fainted by the dozens. Water buckets were placed every few yards. Sweat pooled on the floors, mixing with oil. Helen Davis wiped her forehead with her sleeve as she inspected a power junction panel. Her arms ached, her eyes burned from sleeplessness, and yet the supervisor's voice echoed from the catwalk above. "Keep the pace. The boys at the front are counting on you." The line roared like an engine that never cooled. The men and women below had stopped thinking in hours, days, or even weeks. Life was measured in bombers. Each new fuselage completed was another heartbeat in the rhythm of war. That day, an Army Air Forces photographer came through to capture the spirit of American production. Workers smiled for the camera, but the moment it turned away, their faces collapsed back into fatigue. Later, Helen told a friend, "We didn't need to be told we were winning. We could feel it. The problem was, we couldn't stop." Victory turning into mechanical despair. Across the ocean, Reinhardt attended a meeting in the ruined halls of the Reich Chancellery. The marble floor was cracked, the air stale. The conversation was grim. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, stood at the head of the table with a map covered in red pins. "Gentlemen, America has created an unstoppable model. We can only adapt. We must decentralize our production, move underground, scatter our factories, hide from the bombers. Goring slammed his hand on the table. We will not crawl like rats. Speer's eyes flashed coldly. Then we will die like them. Reinhardt watched the exchange in silence. It no longer felt like strategy, it felt like denial. The empire around him was burning, but the general still spoke in slogans. Later, as he walked the hall, a junior officer approached with a sealed file. From Switzerland, sir. Intercepted correspondence between American engineers. Reinhardt opened it. Inside was a typed note dated July 29, 1943. Willow Run now produces 14 complete aircraft per day. Next objective, reduce final assembly to 45 minutes. Project code, continuous flow. He felt his throat tighten. 45 minutes. The human mind wasn't built to process such efficiency. Factories had become creatures, mechanical predators devouring time itself. There's something almost divine and monstrous in creating a machine that doesn't need to rest. Back in Michigan, Sorensen was beginning to feel the weight of what he'd built. The old industrialist stood on a catwalk one night, staring down at the unending motion below. His engineer approached cautiously. "Sir, we've reached the new target," the man shouted over the noise. "One bomber every 45 minutes. Sorensen nodded, his face unreadable. "Congratulations, sir." But Sorensen didn't answer right away. His voice, when it came, was heavy. "Don't congratulate me. Just pray we never have to do this again." The guilt of success. That same week, news broke across Allied radio networks. Hamburg had been reduced to rubble. Tens of thousands dead. Entire districts consumed by firestorms that burned so hot they melted steel. Helen heard about it during her lunch break. The cafeteria went silent. No one spoke. For the first time, some workers wondered what their hands had created. Later, she confided to her supervisor, "When I close my eyes, I can see the bombs falling. It's like I built them myself." He tried to reassure her. "You built freedom, not bombs." She didn't respond. Moral reflection. Is it still freedom when it's carried on the wings of fire? Meanwhile, in Berlin, Reinhardt met with a group of civilians, engineers, scientists, and quietly, conspirators. These were men who no longer believed Hitler's promises. Some had begun whispering of resistance, even assassination. A physicist named Hans Oster handed Reinhardt a small folder. "We can't outbuild America," he said softly. "But maybe we can stop the madness from consuming what's left of Germany." Reinhardt looked through the documents, plans for an internal coup, coded communications, names of potential sympathizers within the Wehrmacht. He knew what this meant. If caught, they'd be executed. He leaned back in his chair. "You're asking me to choose between my country and my orders." Oster replied, "Your orders are killing your country." The room fell silent. Somewhere far above, a siren began to wail. Midway engagement. If you made it this far, comment orders or conscience. Because that's the choice every man faces when truth collides with loyalty. That night, Reinhardt couldn't sleep. He stood by the window watching the faint red glow to the west, the reflection of cities burning hundreds of kilometers away. Somewhere in that distant fire, his son was fighting. He hadn't received a letter from him in months. He thought of Willow Run again, of the reports, the numbers, the relentless efficiency. He almost admired it. There was something frighteningly pure about it. No ideology, no hatred, just production. It was a mirror of Germany's own dream, twisted and perfected by its enemy. And then, as if mocking him, a fresh telegram arrived just before dawn. U.S. industrial plants now converting to B-29 production. Strategic range, Japan. Estimated output, double Willow Run by early 1944. Reinhardt read it twice. He poured himself a drink with shaking hands. "They're already building the next war," he whispered. In Michigan, Helen looked up as the factory loudspeakers blared a new slogan. "Faster, higher, stronger, every hour counts." The line moved again. The sky beyond the windows glowed pink with sunrise. No one noticed the cracks forming in the roof beams above, the strain of constant vibration, the toll of never stopping. For a moment, Helen felt the floor tremble beneath her boots. She froze, staring upward, as a piece of steel insulation broke loose and crashed near her feet. The entire line hesitated. "Keep going," a foreman shouted. "It's fine, keep going." But it wasn't fine. And that tremor wasn't just physical. It was the world itself beginning to shake under the weight of its own creation. The next part of this story will bring the factory to its breaking point, and reveal the moment even America began to fear what it had built. If you're still here, comment, "The factory trembles." You'll want to see what happens next. October 3, 1943. Ypsilanti, Michigan. The rain had come early that year, soaking the endless fields around Willow Run and turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud. Inside the massive hangar, though, the air was dry and metallic, filled with the clang of hammers and the hiss of hydraulic drills. The shift horn blared at 6 a.m., and another day began like every other. 42,000 people moving as one, every breath timed to the pulse of the machines. But something was different now. The workers could feel it. The tremor in the floor beams had grown stronger, the lights flickered more often. The factory that had once symbolized unstoppable strength now felt fragile, alive, almost resentful of its own momentum. Helen Davis leaned over the control console at Section E, watching the conveyor belts creep forward under a soft red glow. She had learned to read the sounds, the pitch of the drills, the rhythm of the belt motors, and she knew something was off. "Slow it down," she shouted to the foreman. "The line's dragging." He didn't hear her over the noise or didn't want to. They were behind schedule. The new Army directive was clear. Every hour lost was a failure. A loud snap cracked through the air. Sparks showered from a misaligned coupling. Workers ducked as the line shuddered, then lurched back into motion. No one was injured, but the tremor rippled down the mile-long assembly like a sigh from the earth itself. Helen rubbed her temples. "It's not just metal," she whispered. "It's tired. Even machines have breaking points. What happens when a nation's spirit starts to sound the same way?" Across the Atlantic, Colonel Reinhardt stood in the ruins of Kassel. Allied bombers, many born in that same trembling factory, had reduced the city to gray dust. He had traveled there with a team to assess the damage, but there was nothing to assess. Streets were gone. Buildings flattened. The air smelled of lime and ash. He found the body of a Luftwaffe mechanic near the remains of an aircraft hangar. The man's hand still clutched a wrench. Reinhardt knelt beside him and quietly removed his helmet. There were no words to describe it anymore. Back in Berlin, the Abwehr was unraveling. The resistance within the army was growing bolder, whispering openly about removing Hitler before Germany was annihilated. Reinhardt had attended one of their secret meetings in a bombed-out apartment in Charlottenburg. A map of Berlin lay across a candlelit table. Hans Oster was there again, along with several officers he recognized only by rank, not name. They spoke in low tones about an operation, something bold, final. A name was mentioned, Valkyrie. Reinhardt listened silently, his mind torn in two. He had sworn an oath, but to what? A flag? A man? Or to a nation that no longer existed except in ruins? Oster turned to him. "Colonel, you have access to communications from the industrial front. We need to know when the Americans strike next. The city won't survive another firestorm." Reinhardt's hand trembled as he took a sip of water. "You're asking me to commit treason." Oster met his eyes. "I'm asking you to save Germany. Loyalty is easy when your cause is clear. It's when your cause rots that loyalty becomes a curse." Meanwhile, in Michigan, another kind of crisis was unfolding. The Ford management had introduced new quotas, a bomber every 42 minutes. The workers' bodies couldn't keep up. Accidents spiked again. Worn-down bolts weren't replaced fast enough. Supervisors screamed until their throats went raw. Helen's crew worked 12-hour shifts. Some hadn't seen daylight in weeks. One woman fainted on the assembly floor. Another was found sleeping beside a fuel line during her break. "People aren't machines," Helen told the plant inspector who came by that week. He barely looked at her. "They'll have to be until the war's done." The following evening she stayed late to recalibrate a power relay. The factory was quieter after midnight, the machinery humming like distant thunder. She could almost hear her own heartbeat, and beneath it, a slow groan from the steel beams above. Then, without warning, a section of the roof gave way. The sound was like a bomb detonating, metal snapping, glass exploding. 100 feet of catwalk collapsed onto the assembly floor, crushing equipment and sending a wave of debris across the line. The emergency sirens wailed. Men and women ran in all directions. Helen ducked behind a crate as dust and sparks rained down around her. She could smell burning oil. When the smoke cleared, 2 workers were dead. A dozen injured. The official report later called it an isolated mechanical failure. But everyone on the floor knew better. Willow Run was breaking down. The cost of endless speed isn't counted in minutes but in lives. For 3 days the factory was shut down for inspection. It was the first silence the workers had known in 2 years. Helen stood outside with her co-workers, watching engineers swarm over the damaged section like ants. The air was strangely peaceful. "Feels wrong, doesn't it?" one man said. To hear nothing. Helen nodded slowly. Almost like we forgot what quiet sounds like. By the fourth day the plant reopened. The line roared again, louder than before, as if to prove it couldn't die. But the accident had left a scar, a reminder that even the great machine could stumble. And in that silence, for the first time, someone began to wonder, what if the war actually ended? What happens to a beast that only knows how to build destruction? In Berlin, Reinhardt met Oster one final time in a dim railway safehouse. The air smelled of coal and damp wood. Oster handed him a coded document wrapped in wax paper. "Operation Valkyrie is in motion," he said. "If it fails, they'll kill us all. If it succeeds, maybe the Americans stop burning our cities." Reinhardt hesitated. "And if it succeeds, will they forgive us?" Oster gave a tired smile. "No. But maybe our children will have a country left to forgive us for." Outside, the train whistle screamed like a dying animal. Reinhardt looked down at the document in his hands. He knew what it meant. Treason, redemption, or death, all of it tangled in the same line of ink. Midway engagement. "If you made it this far, comment Valkyrie, and tell me, would you risk your life to stop your own side from winning?" At Willow Run, production resumed at record speed. The roof had been reinforced, the belts upgraded, and the workers were promised bonuses they'd never receive. The war machine devoured everything: steel, sweat, and silence. Helen returned to her station and saw a familiar slogan painted freshly on the wall: "Speed wins wars." She touched the words with her hand. They were still wet. And for the first time she felt afraid of what victory might look like. That same night, a coded transmission crossed the Atlantic, from the German resistance routed through Sweden, meant for American intelligence. It was signed only with the letter R. It warned of an assassination attempt in Berlin, a last, desperate act to end the madness before Germany fell entirely. But by the time the message reached Washington, it was too late. The bomb was already in place. If you've made it this far, comment, "The bomb is set." The next chapter will take you inside the explosion that shook the Nazi regime, and reveal how Willow Run's roaring heart was still beating through it all. July 20th, 1944. Berlin, Germany. The morning light was soft and deceptive, the kind that made ruins look golden. Colonel Reinhardt stood in the courtyard of the Bendler block, his uniform pressed, his eyes hollow. Around him, officers moved briskly, faces expressionless, voices lowered. Every man there knew what day it was, and what could happen if they failed. In a plain briefcase on a nearby table sat the bomb. A simple package, unimposing, almost forgettable. Inside it, 2 pounds of British-made plastic explosive and a detonator that ticked like a heartbeat. It would be carried into the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's Eastern Front headquarters, by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. Reinhardt's hands trembled as he adjusted his gloves. He had spent weeks funneling information from the industrial front to this moment, believing it would end the madness. But now, standing in the humid Berlin air, he felt an unexpected chill, not of fear but of recognition. Every revolution, he thought, eventually turns its blade inward. A messenger arrived at 10 a.m. sharp. "Stauffenberg has entered the conference room," he whispered. Reinhardt nodded once. No one spoke after that. The air in the room thickened until it felt like they were breathing through cloth. 11:42 a.m., an explosion shook the ground beneath them. Windows rattled. A muffled roar echoed through the corridors. Someone gasped, someone else laughed, a raw, unbelieving sound. "It's done," said Major Albrecht, pale but smiling. "It's done." They believed it for only an hour. Then the phone rang. A voice on the line, sharp and cold as a blade: "The Führer is alive." When evil refuses to die, the world learns how long an hour of hope can feel. Across the ocean, the night shift at Willow Run continued as if nothing had happened. The rhythmic pounding of rivet guns, the groan of cranes, the dull thunder of engines testing along the runway, a symphony of war in perfect time. Helen Davis worked the panel line again, her hands blistered but steady. She'd heard whispers about Germany, rumors that something had happened in Berlin. Maybe a coup, maybe peace. But the supervisors said nothing, and the radio kept playing cheerful propaganda about victory gardens and homefront heroes. In her locker, Helen kept a folded letter from her younger brother, Samuel. He'd joined the Air Corps and was stationed in Italy, flying one of the very bombers built right here in Ypsilanti. His last line haunted her. "Don't worry about me, sis. If these planes fly half as well as they're built, I'll be fine." He'd written that 6 weeks ago. She hadn't heard from him since. The next day a telegram arrived. The kind no one wanted to open. Some losses don't sound like explosions. They come in small white envelopes. Samuel's plane had been shot down over the Adriatic. No survivors. Helen sat on the floor of the locker room, the telegram trembling in her hands, the noise of the factory still roaring above her like a cruel reminder that the world hadn't stopped. One of her co-workers found her there. "You okay, Helen?" She nodded barely. "I built the plane that killed my brother," she whispered. He didn't know what to say. No one ever does when war makes a circle out of grief. Meanwhile in Berlin chaos tore through the night. The Bendler block was surrounded. Officers were arrested, some shot on the spot. Reinhardt watched from a window as soldiers dragged his colleagues into the courtyard. The gunshots came one by one, echoing through the building like a slow drumbeat. Oster was executed that night. Stauffenberg too. Reinhardt was taken to the cellars for interrogation. The SS officer across the table was young, too young. His uniform still smelled of new leather. He asked questions with the confidence of someone who believed his side was eternal. "Why betray your Führer?" the officer asked. Reinhardt looked him straight in the eyes. "Because I loved my country." The officer hesitated. "And now?" Reinhardt smiled faintly. "Now I pity it. There is no glory in betrayal. Only the quiet relief of finally telling the truth." For the next several weeks, Reinhardt was shuttled between interrogation centers. He told them almost nothing. The Gestapo already knew enough. Names, locations, motives. The noose was closing. But among the confiscated documents, one letter went unnoticed, the same coded message Reinhardt had sent to America weeks earlier. It was still circulating through the labyrinth of Allied intelligence, and when analysts finally decoded it, the U.S. War Department realized that Germany was tearing itself apart from within. To the men running Willow Run that meant one thing: push harder. End it before the Germans could regroup. A memo from Washington arrived on September 12. Target: total air superiority by winter. The factory roared into a new gear. Now AB-24 Liberator rolled off the line every 63 minutes, a figure that stunned even the engineers who designed the system. 1.5 million bomber parts every cycle. The numbers were obscene, almost impossible, and yet the machines kept producing as if haunted by momentum itself. Helen watched the endless procession of aircraft, each one gleaming under the fluorescent lights. They looked perfect, cold, merciless. Her supervisor walked past. "You should be proud," he said. "You're helping win the war." She forced a smile. "I just hope we remember how to stop. Victory and destruction often wear the same uniform. Can you always tell which side you're on?" In the ruins of Berlin, Reinhardt sat in a holding cell, writing on scraps of newspaper with a stub of pencil. He had stopped believing in rescue. Instead, he wrote to no one and everyone, fragments of thought that might one day be found by someone trying to understand how madness had become normal. He wrote about the sound of bombs at night, about the smell of wet stone after a raid, about how, for all the talk of power and destiny, men were still just frightened animals trying to justify their hunger. And then, with one final stroke of the pencil, he wrote, "Machines do not hate. Only men teach them to." Midway engagement: if you made it this far, comment "Machines don't hate." And tell me, who's more responsible for war, the hands that build it or the minds that order it? By late 1944, the skies over Germany were black with American bombers. Willow Run's children. Reinhardt could hear them from his cell, the low thunder rolling across the horizon. Each one carried the mark of a factory he'd once studied in disbelief. Somewhere above the clouds, maybe one of those bombers still carried the serial plate Helen had stamped herself. The sound grew louder. The ground shook. The guards ran for cover. And for the briefest instant, Reinhardt smiled. The storm he'd warned them about had finally arrived. If you're still watching, type, "The storm arrived." The next part will take you inside the night Berlin burned, and reveal the final message that connected Willow Run to its greatest enemy. April 26, 1945. Berlin. The city had become a ghost, stripped of sound except for artillery and the endless cry of the wind through ruins. Smoke drifted low, clinging to shattered walls and the husks of streetcars. The Reich was collapsing in slow motion, a giant falling through fire. Colonel Reinhardt sat in what had once been a ministry office, its ceiling half gone, its windows shattered into teeth of glass. He hadn't seen daylight in 3 days. The only light came from a flickering lantern that hissed with each gust of air sneaking through the cracks. On the desk before him lay a torn map of Europe. Most of it was red now, Soviet red pushing from the east, American blue from the west. Germany was a dying body surrounded by its executioners. He had one last document to finish, not for his captors, not for his superiors. For history. for whoever would dare to understand how a nation built the most efficient killing machine in human history, and how it was undone by one that could build faster. He began to write. Factories once whispered like prayers. Now they scream. America built 1.5 million bomber parts every 63 minutes. No human soul could match that rhythm. It wasn't war anymore, it was manufacturing death. When a nation learns to mass-produce destruction, victory starts to look a lot like extinction. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, spring had arrived in Michigan. The snow had melted into the fields around Willow Run, leaving the air damp with oil and thawed mud. The plant's massive hangar doors were open for the first time in months, letting in light that seemed almost too pure for such a place. Helen Davis stood by the final inspection line, clipboard in hand, watching a completed B-24 glide slowly toward the runway. It was her 1,000th inspection, and her last. The war was nearly over. Everyone could feel it. The radio spoke of Allied troops on the outskirts of Berlin, of Hitler in hiding, of surrender terms already being drafted. And yet, inside Willow Run, the machines didn't stop. They'll keep making these until someone orders them not to, her friend said beside her. Helen nodded quietly. That's the thing about machines. They don't know when to quit. The bomber's engines ignited, the floor trembling beneath her boots. She watched it lift off, black smoke curling behind it. For a moment, she wondered if somewhere beneath that same sky, a man in a ruined city was listening to the same thunder and realizing what it meant. Sometimes the sound of victory is indistinguishable from the sound of mourning. That evening, Helen walked home past rows of tiny uniform houses, government-built, identical, soulless. From one porch came the sound of a radio broadcast announcing the liberation of concentration camps. She stopped to listen. The reporter's voice cracked as he described rooms of ash, mountains of shoes, bodies stacked like lumber. Helen covered her mouth. She thought of every bolt she'd tightened, every panel she'd fitted, every part that had carried her hands into the sky, and then down onto cities, onto people she would never meet. She sat on the curb until the sun disappeared. The moment you realize your labor helped end evil, and yet fed it too. In Berlin, Reinhardt's building shook again. The Soviets were only a few blocks away now. The SS had begun executing prisoners in the cellars rather than evacuating them. He had one bullet left in his revolver and one more page to write. He heard the boots before he saw them. 2 soldiers bursting through the doorway, rifles raised. He didn't move. One of them hesitated. The other shouted something in Russian. Reinhardt dropped his weapon and raised his hands slowly. The lantern flickered once, then went out. When he opened his eyes again, he was sitting in the street under gray daylight, hands bound, surrounded by soldiers who didn't know his name and didn't care. The war at last was over for him. The Soviets led him past craters and burning cars, past walls where slogans still clung like ghosts. Sieg Heil. Final victory. He looked up at the sky and thought of all the planes above it, the American bombers still circling, their silhouettes black against the clouds. He whispered to no one, "You built faster. We destroyed ourselves slower." In war, the side that learns efficiency the fastest never needs to learn mercy. Back at Willow Run, the news broke on May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. Crowds filled the streets of Detroit, singing, crying, drinking, kissing strangers. But inside the plant, the mood was different, quieter. Helen walked through the hangar one last time. The machines were still, silent for the first time since 1941. Dust had begun to settle over the belts and rivet guns. The place looked ancient already, a monument to something the world would both celebrate and fear. A supervisor called her name. "You're free, Helen. They're shutting the line down for good." She smiled faintly. "I don't think it ever really stops. Not in here." She tapped her chest. Later, she packed her things, her gloves, her worn badge, a photo of Samuel, and stepped outside into the sunlight. The air was warm, alive again. But her ears still rang with the echo of machinery that had built not just airplanes but history itself. Midway engagement. If you made it this far, comment "Echoes of Steel." Do you believe human progress can ever be separated from human destruction? That same week, Allied intelligence officers combed through Berlin's ruins, collecting documents, diaries, anything that could explain how the Third Reich's war machine had functioned. One file stood out, weather-stained and signed, found in the remains of the ministry building. It contained Reinhardt's final words. His notes described not only Germany's collapse, but the miracle of America's production. "They built as if time itself were an enemy to defeat," he wrote. "They replaced faith with assembly lines and won. But what happens when the war ends and the machine keeps running? An officer in Washington later read the report and marked one line in red ink. Machines do not hate. But they do not forgive either. The world that rose from the ashes would learn that lesson again in Korea, in Vietnam, in every war since. Years later, Willow Run stood abandoned, its walls rusting, its floors cracked, pigeons nesting where engineers once built engines of war. But when the wind blew through the hangar, it still made the faintest sound, a low metallic hum like distant thunder. Some say it was just the wind. Others say it was the sound of ghosts, the ghosts of men and women who learned that victory had a heartbeat, and that it never really stopped. If you made it this far, comment, "Never stopped," to prove you're one of the real ones. Because the next story, the one about what America did with the machine after the war, might just change how you see every factory, every drone, every screen glowing in the dark today. August 12, 1946. Dearborn, Michigan. The war had been over for more than a year, but inside Ford headquarters, the air still carried the scent of urgency, of blueprints, oil, and ambition. Willow Run sat idle now, a steel skeleton stretching toward the horizon, but Henry Ford's son, Edsel, was already in meetings about what to do with it. America's war machine had been too good at its job. The same system that could build 1.5 million bomber parts every 63 minutes was now a question mark. A machine without a purpose. In Washington, men in tailored suits gathered around long oak tables, papers stacked like ammunition. The Cold War had already begun. The word Russia was whispered now the way Germany once was. One senator said it plainly, "If we can build that fast for war, we can build that fast for deterrence." That same week, Helen Davis received a letter from the War Department. It wasn't about her brother this time. It was an invitation. A government initiative called the National Industrial Defense Network wanted experienced production workers for a new generation of facilities. They promised better pay, shorter hours, safer conditions. She folded the letter slowly. The word sounded familiar. Too familiar. What if the end of one war is only the construction phase of the next? In Berlin, Colonel Reinhardt, now listed as missing, presumed dead by the Soviet archives, was very much alive. The Red Army had taken him east, first to Poland, then into the heart of the USSR. His knowledge of Germany's industrial systems, and his observations about America's, made him valuable. He spent his days in interrogation rooms answering the same question in different accents. How did they do it? They didn't, he'd reply. The machines did. They just kept feeding them people. The officer across the table would frown. But how did they organize it? Reinhardt smiled faintly. By removing the human from the equation. Mini emotional beat. Once you teach a nation to dehumanize for efficiency, it never forgets how. Back in Michigan, Helen took a train to Detroit for the first time since the plant closed. She passed fields still littered with rusted machinery, piles of scrap aluminum stacked like monuments. The city looked tired, full of factories too large for peace and too empty for war. At the hotel, she met a group of former Willow Run engineers. One of them, a thin man with sharp glasses, spoke excitedly about the future. "We're not done," he said. "The government's already funding jet research. And atomic propulsion. They want us to think bigger." Helen stared at him. "Bigger than bombers?" He grinned. "Oh yes, bombers that never land." She felt her stomach tighten. "You mean?" He cut her off, whispering now, "They're calling it Strategic Air Command." The machines had rested for a year. Now they were waking up again, this time with wings that never needed to stop. Meanwhile, in Moscow, a Soviet general named Kuznetsov read a translated copy of Reinhardt's notes. He underlined one passage again and again. The Americans built not for war but for momentum. Remove the enemy and they will build anyway. To Kuznetsov that wasn't a warning, it was a template. Within months, Soviet factories began operating 24 hours a day, copying the American production rhythm. The Cold War's industrial arms race had begun not with bombs, but with blueprints stolen from Willow Run's ghost. Reinhardt, watching from his assigned housing block outside Minsk, saw it coming. The smoke rising from the chimneys, the endless rhythm of the machines, it was all happening again. He wrote in his notebook, "They are learning to fear us by becoming us." Every empire eventually builds its own reflection and mistakes it for safety. By 1947, Helen was back at work, not in a bomber plant, but at a new facility in Ohio producing engine parts for civilian aircraft. But she could see the insignia on the paperwork, small, stamped, almost hidden. U.S. Air Force Contract 2403B. During lunch breaks, she'd hear rumors. Nuclear-capable planes. Intercontinental prototypes. weapons so fast they could outfly the sunrise. One afternoon, as she inspected a polished engine casing, she noticed something strange. A serial plate marked WR001. Willow Run. The parts were being stamped with the same identification code system from the old plant. The machine hadn't just been restarted. It had been replicated. Some ghosts don't haunt places. They haunt blueprints. In the spring of that same year, the U.S. government officially announced a new industrial directive, Operation Arsenal. Its goal? To adapt wartime production to peacetime defense. The public was told it was about jobs, prosperity, and innovation. Privately, it was about readiness, the unspoken belief that America might need to outbuild the next enemy before the next war even started. Helen's supervisor gathered the workers one morning and made the announcement official. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "the nation that can build the most will always win. That's our legacy. Let's make sure it stays that way." The room applauded. Helen didn't. She thought of Samuel's telegram, of the faces of tired women under the roar of the machines, of the ghosts of steel still whispering from the walls of Willow Run. After work, she walked to the edge of the airfield and watched the test planes streak across the sky, thin trails of vapor fading into the distance. Midway engagement. If you made it this far, comment, momentum never dies. Do you think a nation can truly return to peace once it's learned how to build for war? Thousands of miles away, Reinhardt sat in a Soviet lecture hall, surrounded by officers taking notes on American production philosophy. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very efficiency that had once destroyed his homeland was now being resurrected by his captors. When one young officer asked him what the secret was, Reinhardt paused. "The secret," he said, "is that they never built machines to win wars. They built them to forget death." The officer frowned. "That makes no sense." Reinhardt nodded. "That's why it worked." Later that night, he slipped a letter under his door, addressed to no one in particular, perhaps to Helen, perhaps to history itself. "We all serve machines now. The flags change, the uniforms change, but the rhythm stays the same. Somewhere in America, a woman still hears the echo of hammers. Somewhere in Russia, a man still dreams of catching up. Neither realizes they already have." He closed the notebook and turned off the light. The room filled with silence, the only true peace left in a world still addicted to production. If you're still here, comment, "The rhythm stayed." Because in the final chapter you'll see what that rhythm became, not in bombers but in something much closer to home. The birth of the modern industrial world that still hums beneath your fingertips today. The years rolled forward like the conveyor belts that once carried bombers down the line. 1948, 1950, 1953. The Cold War thickened like a second atmosphere. What began in steel had evolved into circuitry. America had learned to build fear into metal. Helen stayed in Ohio until the end of the decade. Each year she watched the factory grow quieter, then louder again under new contracts. The faces changed. The purpose didn't. When she retired, her hands still bore faint crescent scars from rivet tools. The government sent her a certificate of commendation for outstanding civilian service in support of national security. She burned it in her backyard that night. The ashes drifted up, small and silver, like shavings of old aluminum. In Moscow, Colonel Kuznetsov's factories had reached their own fever pitch. The Soviets now had bombers that could rival the B-29, even surpass it. Reinhardt's notes had been fully integrated into the state's production manuals. His name was erased from every page. He no longer existed except as an echo of an idea. When he was finally released in 1954, they gave him a small apartment and a pension. He spent his days walking the outskirts of the city, watching smokestacks twist their black ribbons into the sky. He realized the world had entered a new phase, not destruction but maintenance. Every nation was now tending the same machine. In America, the children of Willow Run's workers were growing up in a different kind of war. Air raid drills in schools. Atomic shelters in basements. Radio programs teaching how to duck and cover. Yet behind the fear was pride, the same pride that had once fueled the line. The belief that if something was built in America, it would stand. In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik. The world looked up and saw what the next battlefield would be. Space was just another factory floor, infinite and waiting. By then, Willow Run had been converted again, this time into a research center for aerospace technology. Scientists walked the same halls where Helen once carried toolboxes. The walls still smelled faintly of oil and sweat. Someone had painted over the old slogans, but if you looked close enough, you could still make out the words beneath, "Keep 'em flying." Helen returned once, years later, on a gray afternoon in 1961. She stood at the gate, her hair streaked white, her shoes dusted with mud. Security guards didn't recognize her. She didn't explain who she was. She just looked at the massive hangar doors and listened. Inside, machines hummed again, softer now, higher pitched like 1,000 metallic bees. She whispered, "You never stopped, did you?" A breeze swept across the field, carrying the distant clang of metal. She smiled sadly. No one ever does. Across the ocean, Reinhardt died quietly in a Minsk hospital that same year. Among his few possessions was a thin notebook. The final entry read, "The machine outlived the war. It will outlive all of us." What began as victory became habit, and habit became faith. The nurse who found it didn't understand the words. She used the notebook to start a fire for warmth. The pages curled, blackened, and vanished. Every age thinks it has escaped the rhythm, until it hears it again in the distance, a hum beneath the silence. Decades later, in 1987, a young engineer named Mark Rosen walked through the same Willow Run complex, now abandoned and half reclaimed by weeds. He was cataloging artifacts for a historical preservation project. In one storage room under a collapsed shelf, he found a rusted rivet gun. It still had initials scratched into the handle, HD. He cleaned it carefully, set it on a display table, and wrote a small card beside it. Willow Run, the arsenal of democracy. But if you stood there long enough, past the sound of your own breathing, you might have heard it, faint, rhythmic, steady, the echo of a production line that once believed it could outbuild death itself. The true legacy of Willow Run wasn't just what it built, but what it taught humanity to worship: speed, scale, and the illusion of control. Fade to modern day. Drone footage glides over the remains of the plant. Empty parking lots. Cracked glass. Pigeons nesting where engines once roared. The narrator's voice quiets. History doesn't always end when the machines stop. Sometimes it ends when no one remembers why they were built. Then, a cut to archival footage, rows of women riveting under the banner, "Victory through production." Their faces blurred, their movements synchronized. The image fades into a modern assembly line. Robotic arms, LED panels, precision perfect. The rhythm is identical. 80 years later, the machines are still building. Only the names have changed. Back in a museum display case, Helen's rivet gun rests under soft white light. Children walk past, barely glancing at it. A small plaque tells the story of a plant that helped win a war. But if you lean close enough, you can still see the fingerprint marks etched into the handle. Proof that somewhere, someone once gave everything to keep the line moving. And if you listen closely, maybe you'll hear it too, that faint mechanical heartbeat pulsing beneath the hum of the present world. Because Willow Run was never just a factory. It was the sound of a nation teaching itself to run forever.